The day was already one of the hardest I had ever faced. My mother's funeral was a somber, surreal experience, as something I had mentally prepared for. Yet the weight of it hit me with an intensity that left me feeling hollow. I had spent days in the hospital by her side, watching her deteriorate, knowing there was nothing I could do to change the inevitable. But knowing something is coming doesn't make the pain of losing a loved one any easier to bear. The funeral was small and intimate, close family and friends gathering to say their goodbyes. I was emotionally exhausted, but grateful for the support I received from those around me. Everyone seemed to know just how fragile I was in that moment, offering quiet hugs and whispered words of comfort. Everyone, that is, except for my husband, Alex. Alex had been absent for most of the difficult moments leading up to my mother's death. He was busy with work, or at least that's what he always said. I tried to understand, to make excuses for him, to reason that he didn't know how to deal with grief the way I did. After all, he had never been close to my mom, but still, I had hoped he would be there for me, if not for her. That day, at the funeral, his absence was glaring. He hadn't come, claiming last-minute work obligations, and I told myself I could get through it on my own. I would survive this alone. I had already been doing so much of it alone anyway. After the service, I found myself returning home, drained and empty, hoping that being in my familiar space would bring some comfort. What I didn't expect was for my world to shatter even further. I walked into the house, the quietness of it amplifying the sense of loneliness that had clung to me since the moment I watched my mother take her last breath. I called out for Alex, half-heartedly expecting to find him in his office or the kitchen. The house was still, unnaturally so, until I heard a noise upstairs. My stomach twisted as I made my way up the steps, each footfall heavy with a sense of foreboding. As I reached the bedroom door, I heard it again, a muffled laugh, a sound so out of place in the grief-laden atmosphere I had been living in that it took me a moment to process. The door was slightly ajar, and when I pushed it open, the scene that greeted me sent ice through my veins. There he was, in our bed, with someone else. For a moment, the world stopped. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My body felt detached from reality as my brain tried to catch up with what my eyes were seeing. Alex, the man I had vowed to spend the rest of my life with, was lying in bed with another woman. Our bed, the same bed I had cried myself to sleep in for the past few weeks, overwhelmed by my mother's illness, my grief, and now this. The betrayal was so raw, so immediate, that I thought I might be sick. They didn't even notice me at first. Their laughter had drowned out the sound of the door creaking open. But when Alex's eyes finally met mine, the look on his face was something I'll never forget. There wasn't shock, there wasn't guilt, just a flicker of annoyance, as if I had interrupted something he deemed more important than the decency of his marriage vows. "What the hell?" I heard myself whisper, my voice shaking with disbelief and anger. Alex scrambled out of bed, pulling the sheets with him as if covering himself would somehow shield him from the consequences of his actions. The woman, a stranger to me, looked equally shocked, but her presence faded into the background of my mind. All I could see was him, this man I had trusted, loved, and leaned on for support, now reduced to a stranger who had betrayed me in the most unforgivable way. "Jess," he started, but I didn't let him finish. I couldn't bear to hear whatever pathetic excuse was about to spill from his mouth. "While I was burying my mother," I choked out, my voice a mix of fury and heartbreak. "You were here, doing this." He stepped toward me, but I held up my hand to stop him. "Don't," I hissed, my entire body trembling. "Don't come near me." I didn't need an explanation. I didn't want one. There was nothing he could say that would justify what he had done. In that moment, the clarity hit me like a wave. This wasn't just a betrayal of our marriage, it was a betrayal of me, of everything I had thought we shared. For weeks, I had been drowning in grief, and instead of supporting me, instead of being the partner I needed, he had chosen to destroy the last shred of stability I had left. I had spent years making excuses for his absence, for his emotional distance. I had convinced myself that this was just the way relationships were: imperfect, messy, but still worth fighting for. But in that instant, I knew the truth. He wasn't worth fighting for, not anymore. "I want a divorce," I said, my voice stronger than I expected. The words felt final, like they were closing the door on a chapter of my life that had already been over for far too long. Alex's eyes widened. Jess, wait, let's talk about this. It wasn't what it looked like. I laughed bitterly, cutting him off. Not what it looked like. You were in bed with another woman. Alex, it's exactly what it looks like. My heart pounded in my chest, my emotions swinging wildly between rage and sorrow. You couldn't even wait until I was back from my mom's funeral. How pathetic is that? He didn't have an answer. He just stood there, his face a mixture of shame and anger. Maybe he thought I would back down, that I would let him explain, that I would forgive him the way I have forgiven so many of his shortcomings before. But this was different. This was unforgivable. I'm done, I said, turning on my heel and walking out of the room, out of the house that no longer felt like my home. I don't remember the drive back to my sister's place. It was all a blur of tears, anger, and disbelief. But what I do remember is the overwhelming sense of relief that washed over me when I finally made the decision to leave. I had spent so long holding on to a relationship that wasn't worth my time, my energy, or my love. I had convinced myself that staying was the right thing to do, even when it meant sacrificing parts of myself in the process. But now, as I sat her day in my car, staring blankly out the window, I realized that walking away was the best thing I could do. I deserved more. I deserved someone who would be there for me in the darkest moments, not someone who would betray me when I needed them most. The next day, I filed for a divorce. Alex tried to call, to apologize, to beg for another chance, but I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The decision to divorce Alex was swift, but the aftermath was anything but easy. As much as I wanted to walk away from it all and never look back, the logistics of separating our lives were complex and painful. We had built a life together, bought a home, and woven our routines so deeply into each other that untangling them felt like trying to rip out a root without disturbing the soil. But I was determined. For the first time in years, I felt like I was standing up for myself in a way that truly mattered. Alex had taken so much from me: trust, my sense of security, my belief in our marriage, and I wasn't about to let him take any more. A few days after I filed for divorce, Alex showed up at my sister's house, where I had been staying since the night I walked out. My sister, Leah, had been my rock through the whole ordeal, offering me a place to stay and an endless supply of wine and comforting words. She answered the door when Alex arrived, and the look on her face told me everything I needed to know. "Do you want to talk to him?" Leah asked, her tone cautious, as if she was afraid my answer would break me. I shook my head, no. But as much as I wanted to avoid the confrontation, I knew it was inevitable. I had to face him, to make it clear that there was no going back. Taking a deep breath, I walked to the door, steeling myself for what was sure to be an emotional battle. Alex was standing on the porch, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and desperation. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, his hair disheveled and his clothes wrinkled, but I didn't feel sympathy for him. Not anymore. "Jess, please," he began, his voice low and pleading. "Can we talk?" I crossed my arms, keeping the distance between us. "What's there to talk about? Alex, you cheated on me, in our bed, while I was at my mom's funeral." He flinched at the bluntness of my words, but I didn't hold back. I wasn't going to soften the truth for his comfort. He needed to feel the full weight of what he had done. "I know I messed up," he said, his voice cracking. "I know I hurt you, and I'm sorry. I've been a terrible husband. But please, Jess, don't throw away everything we've built." I stared at him in disbelief. "You think I'm the one throwing this away? You're the one who betrayed me. Alex, you're the one who destroyed our marriage." He took a step closer, but I held up my hand to stop him. "I'm not interested in hearing your excuses. I don't want to know why you did it. All I care about is that you did it, and that's enough for me to walk away." "But we've been through so much together," he argued, desperation creeping into his voice. "Doesn't that count for something?" It did. For a long time, it had counted for everything, but not anymore. "Not enough to make me stay," I said, my voice steady despite the emotion bubbling beneath the surface. "I deserve better, Alex, and you know it." For a moment, he looked like he was going to argue, but then his shoulders slumped, and he let out a long, defeated sigh. I don't want to lose you, he whispered. You already have, I replied, my heart breaking a little more with each word. The moment you chose to betray me, you lost me. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with all the things we would never say to each other. There was no point in continuing the conversation. No amount of apologies or explanations could undo the damage that had been done. The trust between us was broken beyond repair, and the love I had once felt for him was now buried beneath layers of hurt and betrayal. Without another word, I turned and walked back into the house, closing the door behind me. I leaned against it, my chest heaving as the weight of the confrontation settled over me. Leah appeared at my side, her hand resting gently on my shoulder. You did the right thing, she said softly, her voice filled with reassurance. I know, I whispered, but the ache in my heart told me that doing the right thing didn't make it any less painful. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, meetings with lawyers, and countless moments where I had to remind myself that I was doing this for my own well-being. Divorce was messier than I had imagined, not just in a legal sense, but emotionally as well. I had spent years building a life with Alex, and now, every detail of that life had to be untangled, divided, and ultimately erased. I found myself thinking about the small things way. We used to cook breakfast together on Sunday mornings, the sound of his laugh when we watched our favorite TV shows, the inside jokes that only we understood. Those moments had once been a source of joy, but now, they were just painful reminders of what I had lost, or perhaps, what had never really been there in the first place. Leah was a constant presence, reminding me that I wasn't alone in this. She helped me pack up my things from the house, her anger toward Alex barely contained as we boxed up years of memories. I thought it would be harder to go through our shared belongings, but with each item I placed in a box, I felt lighter. The house no longer felt like a home. It was just a place filled with broken promises. Are you sure you don't want to take more of the furniture? Leah asked as we stood in the living room, surveying what was left. I shook my head. Mo, let him keep it. I don't want any of it. It wasn't about the material things. I wanted a fresh start, free from the remnants of a marriage that had failed me in the most profound way. I needed space to rebuild my life on my own terms, without the weight of the past dragging me down. The finalization of the divorce came quicker than I expected. A few months later, I walked out of the courthouse with a sense of closure I hadn't thought possible. It was done. The marriage, the heartbreak, the betrayal, it was all behind me now. As I stood outside, the cool breeze brushing against my skin, I took a deep breath and let it out slowly. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt free. The grief was still there. Of course, that grief for my mother, for the loss of the life I had once imagined, but it no longer consumed me. I had survived the worst of it, and now I was ready to move forward. I had no idea what the future held, but I was ready to embrace it. I was ready to find happiness again, on my own terms, without the shadow of betrayal hanging over me. Leah met me outside, her eyes filled with pride and love. You did it, she said, pulling me into a hug. As the days went by after the divorce was finalized, I slowly began to reclaim pieces of myself that had been buried under years of compromise and heartache. There was an odd sense of calm that followed the chaos. Life wasn't exactly perfect. Grief still lingered in the quiet moments, both for my mom and the marriage that had ended in betrayal, but there was also a newfound peace. I no longer had to carry the weight of wondering whether Alex cared, whether I was good enough, or whether I was making the right decisions. I had chosen me, and that was enough. Leah encouraged me to dive back into things I loved, things I had let go of during my marriage. I found myself picking up old hobbies, like painting and gardening. These small acts of creation gave me a sense of purpose and reminded me that there was still beauty in the world, even when it felt like everything had crumbled. One weekend, Leah dragged me to a yoga retreat in the countryside. At first, I had resisted. I wasn't sure I was ready to be around so many people, let alone strangers. But Leah, ever the optimist, insisted it would be good for me. You've been cooped up in your own thoughts for too long, she said with a grin as we drove out of the city. It's time to let some fresh air in. The retreat was set in a beautiful, peaceful valley. There were rolling hills, quiet streams, and plenty of open space to breathe. For the first time in months, I felt like I could exhale without feeling the crushing weight of everything I'd been through. The combination of meditation, nature, and quiet time allowed me to reflect without the overwhelming emotions that usually accompany those thoughts. One afternoon, as I sat by the stream, watching the water flow over the rocks, I thought about my mother. Losing her had been harder than I could have ever imagined. She had been my guiding light, my constant support, and even though I was learning to navigate life without her, the ache of her absence was always there. But in that moment, sitting alone in the peaceful silence, I felt her presence in a different way. It was as though she was watching over me, reminding me that I was stronger than I gave myself credit for. I smiled softly, feeling a tear slip down my cheek, but this time it wasn't from sadness, it was from the realization that I was going to be okay. As the weeks turned into months, I began to feel more settled in my new life. I had moved into a small apartment downtown, a place that was all mine. Decorating it had been a therapeutic process. He filled it with things that made me happy, that reflected who I was now. Every corner of the space felt like me, like home. There was no room for Alex in it, no reminders of our life together. I had no interest in dating, not yet anyway. It wasn't that I didn't believe in love anymore, it was just that I needed time to heal, to find myself again. Leah tried setting me up a couple of times, but I always politely declined. There was no rush. For the first time in years, I wasn't in a hurry to fill a void or prove something to anyone. I was content to focus on myself, to rebuild from the ground up. It wasn't until one evening, as I sat in a county cafe, sipping tea and reading a novel, that I bumped into someone unexpected. Jess. I looked up from my book, startled by the familiar voice. My heart skipped a beat as my eyes met a pair of warm, brown eyes. It was Matt, an old friend from college. We had lost touch over the years, but there had been a time when we were close. He had always been the kind of person who could make you laugh no matter how bad your day was. Matt, I smiled, setting my book down. I can't believe it. What are you doing here? We hugged, and he sat down at my table, both of us laughing at the unexpected reunion. It felt like no time had passed, even though it had been years since we'd last spoken. We spent the next few hours catching up, talking about everything that had happened in our lives since college. He told me about his career as a journalist, his travels, and the ups and downs of life. I shared bits and pieces of my story, carefully omitting the worst parts of the last year, not ready to dive into that chapter just yet. It was easy being around Matt, as if a piece of my old life had resurfaced just when I needed it most. He was kind, funny, and genuine, qualities I hadn't realized I missed in the people I had surrounded myself with over the last few years. As we chatted, I realized something profound. For the first time in a long time, I was enjoying someone's company without feeling like I had to pretend. I wasn't holding my breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was simply there, in the moment, being myself. Matt and I stayed in touch after that night, meeting up for coffee or dinner every now and then. He wasn't pushy, and I appreciated that. Our friendship was exactly what I needed. No expectations, no pressure, just an easy connection that reminded me of who I was before life got so complicated. Months later, on a rainy afternoon, I received an unexpected message from Alex. It was short, just a few lines, but it stirred emotions I thought I had long buried. I've been thinking a lot about us lately. I know it's too late to fix things, but I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I hope you're doing okay. I stared at the message for a long time, unsure of how to respond. Part of me wanted to delete it and move on, but another part of me, perhaps the part that had once loved him, felt the need to acknowledge it. In the end, I sent a short reply. I'm doing okay. I hope you are too. Take care. It wasn't a reconciliation, and it wasn't forgiveness in the traditional sense, but it was closure. The final thread that tied me to Alex was now cut. As I set my phone down, I realized that the old wounds had finally healed. I no longer needed answers from Alex, no longer needed validation or apologies. I was at peace with the way things had turned out. The pain of betrayal was a distant memory, and the person I had become in the aftermath was stronger, wiser, and happier. It's funny how life works sometimes. You think you're broken beyond repair, that the hurt will last forever, but then, slowly, without even realizing it, you start to heal. You rebuild yourself from the pieces that are left. And what you become is something new, something resilient. I'll never forget what Alex did, but I no longer dwell on it. He's part of my past, but that's all. He's now part of a story that led me to where I am today.